Okay, well, my name is John Yo. I teach Old Testament here at Southern California Seminary, and I'm going to give a paper called an Exegetical Biblical-Theological Case for Prophetic Foreshortening between Daniel 9:26 and 9:27. I just have to make a quick confession here. This paper is 32 pages long, so the original is online, so this is going to be very truncated. Okay, so I actually had to leave out 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, so you can read that online if you're interested. So I'm just really going to be covering Daniel 9, 20, 26, 27, and then Romans 11, just the last part of Romans 11. So let's get into the introduction. The notion of a parenthesis between Daniel 9:26 and 9:27 has been perennially denied and even mocked among evangelicals. For example, Michael Horton states, in classical dispensationalism, God's ultimate program involves the nation Israel. The church is a parenthesis, according to Schaeffer, a sort of footnote or sidetrack in contrast to God's main mission to save ethnic national Israel. We believe that this position gravely misunderstands the plan of God and the clear teaching of the scriptures. Yet the notion of a parenthesis, especially in prophetic texts, is an established hermeneutical feature known as prophetic foreshortening. Robert Plummer of Southern Seminary defines it in the following manner: the technical term for a variety of future events being viewed together without strict chronological sequencing is prophetic foreshortening. He further notes, it has been pointed out that the first and second comings of Jesus are described in the Old Testament with prophetic foreshortening. That is, only with the completion of the first coming of Jesus are we able to see clearly that the Messiah's visible and universal reign, the consummated kingdom, will come after a gap of time. And notice the word gap. Randall Price provides an alternative technical expression for prophetic foreshortening, which is derived from the Greek verb apotello, meaning to bring to completion or finish. This apotelismatic interpretation recognizes that in Old Testament texts that present the messianic program as a single event, a near and far historical fulfillment is intended, separated by an indeterminate period of time. Although he recognizes that older dispensationalists have used the words like intercalation and gap, Price prefers the phrase prophetic postponement because it retains the original idea of an interruption in fulfillment while supplementing it with the notion that such a delay is temporary and prophetic because we understand a purposeful, preordained act in the divine program. So even among evangelicals, we find claims of parentheses among works of Reformed and Covenant theologians. Therefore, the debate is not whether parentheses exist in Scripture and redemptive history, but if the presence of an interval or gap is justified. Therefore, this paper will demonstrate that a parenthesis exists between Daniel 9:26 and 27. Although this has been acknowledged among dispensations for decades, there is a dearth of works that have highlighted and brought to the fore the exegetical and biblical-theological connections that support and firm up previously held views regarding an interval between the 69th and 70th weeks in Daniel 9. To that end, Romans 11, 17 through 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 8 will be employed in support of the view that a parenthesis is present between Daniel 9:26 and 27. And again, I'm not going to be talking tonight about 2 Thessalonians 2 just to save time. Prophetic foreshortening in the book of Daniel, the parentheses in Daniel 2 and 7. In Daniel 2:28, the interpretation of the prophecy given to King Nebuchadnezzar concerning the Colossus image concerned what will take place in the latter days. Daniel revealed that the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar, who represented the Babylonian Empire. The other kingdoms were not identified as these remain future from Daniel's vantage point. However, in Daniel 2:33, two phases in the fourth kingdom are distinguishable. The first phase is represented by the legs of iron, 2:33a, and the second phase is represented by the feet made partly of iron, partly of baked clay, 2:33b. In Daniel's interpretation, he again presents a two-phase distinction. The first phase describes the fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so that like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces, 2:40. While the second phase refers to the feet and toes made up of part clay and part iron, which will be a divided kingdom, 2:41. So some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle, 242b. Thus, there is a clear two-phase appearance to the fourth kingdom, one that will be strong like iron and another that will be strong yet brittle. Gleason Archer notes, verse 41 deals with a later phase or outgrowth of this fourth empire, symbolized by the feet and 10 toes, made up of iron and earthenware, a fragile base with a huge monument. The text clearly implies that this final phase will be marked by some sort of federation, rather than a powerful single realm. The four beasts in Daniel 7 represent the same kingdoms as the one given in Daniel 2. The first beast was like a lion with wings of an eagle. The second beast resembled a bear. The third was like a leopard with four wings of a bird. And the fourth beast was a dreadful and extremely strong beast with large iron teeth. The description of the fourth beast matches the strength and fearsomeness of the first phase of the Roman Empire until the 10 horns are mentioned. The major difference between the first phase description of the fourth beast, 7:7, to its second phase is the mention of the little horn, which extracts 3 of the 10 horns before it, 7:8. The similarity between the two visions are the 10 toes of the clay iron feet and the 10 horns. The symbolism of the feet with 10 toes resembles the fragile unity among the 10 horns, which are 10 kings. There is a noticeable difference between the unity of the 10 kings in their first phase as opposed to the second phase, when the Antichrist will dominate 3 of the 10 kings in order to rise above the other 6, 7:24 through 25. In agreement, Archer avers, verse 8 introduces a new feature concerning this latter-day 10-state federation, namely the emergence of one of the smaller horns as the largest of them all. This little horn becomes dominant by uprooting and destroying 3 of its adjacent horns, resulting apparently in the survival of the remaining 6 as vassal powers under the overlordship of the enlarged horn. Therefore, the 2 phases of the Roman kingdom are apparently separated by a parenthesis of an unspecified period of time. Michael Rydelnik states, a more likely explanation is to recognize a prophetic gap between the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome 1, and lasting through the establishment of a revived Roman Empire at the end of days, Rome 2. The leader of this kingdom will be the little horn of Daniel 7:8 and 7:24 through 25. The destruction of this last phase of the Roman Empire will come with the establishment of the kingdom of God. The interval between the 2 Roman phases is not exactly coterminous with the intercalation between the 69th and the 70th weeks, since the first Roman phase continued after the 69th week had come to an end, and the second phase will begin with the rise of the Antichrist as detailed in Daniel 7:8 and Revelation 13:1-8. This will occur at the beginning of the 70th week and thus marking the closure of the parenthesis known as the church age. So in my third section is prophetic foreshortening in Daniel 9. So there are 4 different views of Daniel 9:24 through 27. And I'm just going to be very brief, and I'm just going to give a brief summary with regard to this. So there is what is known as the Maccabean interpretation. This is normally called the historical critical view, with the terminus ad quo, meaning the starting point, to be in 605 or 586 BC. So either the first Babylonian deportation or destruction of the temple, and the terminus ad quem, which means the end point, either in 167, anywhere between 167 and 165 BC, when the temple was purified, or when Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. Okay, so that's really the liberal historical critical view. You can see a little chart here. So it's usually, the priest Onias III. That's the end of the 69 weeks. And notice that these weeks then, that there is no gap. So for the historical critical view, they don't see a gap at all. Okay. Then we go to the Roman interpretation with its terminus ad quo in the Persian period, either Cyrus 538, Darius 519, or Artaxerxes in either 458 or 445, and the terminus ad quem in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple by Titus. I'm going to skip the Hasmonean just because it's not very popular. It's not very well known. But of course, the eschatological interpretation with the terminus ad quo in the Persian period, Artaxerxes in 457 or 445, and the terminus ad quem in the end times at the midpoint of the 70th week with the desecration of the temple by Antichrist. The eschatological interpretation is also sometimes combined with both the Maccabean and Roman interpretations by those who view the passage as having the dual reference and fulfillment. And I might add, like somebody like Arnold Fruchtenbaum would say it's not Artaxerxes, but he points to Cyrus. So he actually goes earlier than Artaxerxes. And so we have here, the view whether it begins in 445 or 448. And then so notice how both of these have a parenthesis. And these are both dispensational interpretations of Daniel chapter 9, 24, and 27, yes. So I'm going to talk about Thomas Micomiskey, his non-messianic Roman eschatological view. And so the reason why I want to tackle him is because somebody like Robert Chisholm of Dallas Seminary actually is supporting this in his book on the prophets. And so I kind of wanted to kind of tackle this just so that people have a good understanding of what Chisholm is actually trying to support. So Micomiskey actually believes that the use of now this is a Hebrew accent mark that's within 925, verse 25 of chapter 9. And it falls between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. So because it's between the 7 and the 62, he believes that there should be some sort of separation. So if you don't read it as 69 weeks together, it's not 7 plus 62, but it's 7 weeks separately and then 62 weeks separately. Okay, so he thinks there should be like a period or a semicolon in between. So according to Micomiskey, the Masoretes placed a disjunctive accent ethnok between the words 7 weeks and 62 weeks in 925 that should not be disregarded. He believes that the punctuation of the text should follow the Revised Standard Version. There shall be 7 weeks, and notice the period, then for 62 weeks, so on and so forth. As opposed to the NASB, which states there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So do you see how that ethnok really matters? The importance of the issue contextually is whether the Messiah, the Prince, will come at the end of the first 7 weeks or at the end of the 69 weeks, respectively. Micomiskey duly cites the objections to following the accent. Number one, the Masoretic accentuation is late. Number two, earlier text traditions, including the Theodosian version of the Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac, combine the numeral 7 and 62, so they read it as 69. And three, the Masoretic tradition may reflect an anti-Christian bias. And this is all true. However, Micomiskey notes that in spite of the lateness of the accentuation of the Masoretic text, quote, it may be noted that interpretation reflected in the accentuation of the Masoretic tradition may be found centuries earlier in Christian thought. And here he argues that Christian fathers have separated the 7 from the 62. And he's saying, so if somebody like Hippolytus is doing that, that doesn't sound anti-Christian, right? So that's one of his points. However, Micomiskey overstates his case regarding the ethnok having a full disjunctive value in 925 as if it always functions in this manner. The ethnok is a distinguishing feature that the Hebrew verse is divided into 2 parts termed dichotomy for the purposes of chanting. According to William Wicks, the accentuators did not hesitate to make the strict rules for logical or syntactical division give way when they wished to express emphasis or otherwise give effect to the reading. Thus, the ethnok could express different emphases when reciting the Hebrew text that are similar to our punctuation marks in English grammar. In particular, the various uses of the ethnok when used with numbers include 1, a pausal effect similar to a colon or a semicolon, 2, a pause similar to a comma, or 3, no disjunctive value at all. How then should the ethnok in Daniel 9:25 be understood? Owusu Antwi presents 5 reasons as to why the accent should not be a full disjunctive stop congruent to the English period. Number 1, the Masoretic text employs the conjunctive vug as a coordinative conjunction between 7 weeks and 62 weeks, displaying a close connection between the 2 sets of weeks. In other words, there's a conjunctive vug, there's an and there. Number 2, there is a poetic parallelism in 925 that connects Jerusalem to the 7 weeks and until Messiah the Prince to the 62 weeks. And you can see it here. You can see A, Jerusalem is parallel to B until Messiah the Prince. I'm sorry, Jerusalem 7 weeks here, and then BB1, Messiah 62 weeks. So when you talk about this, you're going to be multiplying 7 times 7 because they're weeks, right? And then, of course, here, you're going to be multiplying that with 62. So what they're saying is that by the end of the seventh week, the first 7, Jerusalem is built. And then by the end of the 62nd 7, then we have Messiah, the appearance of the Messiah. Number 3, the function of the ethnoc after the 7 weeks is to emphasize a 7-week period for the restoration and building of Jerusalem, and thereby project the coming of the long-expected Messiah further into the future. 4, none of the ancient versions, Septuagint, the Theodotian, Syriac, or Vulgate, puts a full disjunctive between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks of Daniel 9:25. And 5, the Qumran texts that relate to Daniel 9:24 through 27 and rabbinic interpretations support a non-disjunctive value of the ethnoc in Daniel 9:25. So I think those are 5 really strong reasons against having a full disjunctive value there. As a result, the ethnoc in 9:25 should not be understood as a full disjunctive. Otherwise, if the ethnoc is used to separate the 7 weeks from the 62 weeks, then the 62 weeks would be connected to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Accordingly, the prophecy then would require 434 years for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, for which there is no historical support. Thus, Owusu Antwi concludes, while the emphatic nature of ethnoc of Daniel 9:25 must be recognized, the 7 and 62 weeks must be seen as one period of 69 weeks, or 483 years, starting from the war to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the appearance of the Messiah, the Prince. Okay. Early Christian interpreters read 69 weeks. Moreover, Mickamiskis claimed that the ethnoc was heeded by the early Christian exegetes such as Hippolytus, Clement of Alexandria, and Eusebius, even though they had the Theodosianic text before them, which ignore the ethnoc, is a mischaracterization of the evidence regarding the early Christian interpretation of Daniel 9:25. Roger Beckwith contradicts him by asserting that before the 3rd century AD, every Christian interpreter and translator in actuality understood the 7 and 62 weeks belong together as a unit. So I quote, all interpreters and translators until Clement of Alexandria and Hippolytus at the beginning of the 3rd century AD understand the 7 weeks and 62 weeks of verse 25 to be a combined period of 69 weeks, at the end of which a single anointed one comes. Even the old Septuagint agrees on this. The Masoretic punctuation, which separates the 7 weeks from the 62 and gives the impression that a different anointed one comes at the end of each, cannot be traced until after the Jewish rejection of Jesus and the disappointment of the Jewish messianic expectation of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Nevertheless, it is by this change of punctuation, which has influenced most modern translations of Daniel and commentaries on Daniel, that the prophecy has come to be regarded as non-messianic. A non-messianic interpretation would have been quite eccentric in the 1st century AD. So let's talk now about Mickamiski's non-messianic view, which necessitates symbolic numbers. So this is his view then of Daniel 9:24 through 27. A result of Mickamiski's insistence of granting the ethnoc a full disjunctive value, he too ends up with a non-messianic interpretation. The terminus ad quo, the starting point, for the first 7 weeks, according to Mickamiski, should not be aligned with a Persian king's decree, but rather a prophetic prediction. Hence, he sees that Jeremiah 29 fulfills, quote, the going forth of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the appearance of Masiach Nagid, which is dated to about 594 BC. So what he's pointing to a passage in Daniel 29 as a starting point. Okay, so he's not talking about any decree of any king, but Jeremiah's prophecy. The major point, however, with this date is that it is too early. The year that the message is given to Daniel was in the 1st year of Darius, who began to reign in 538 BC. The Hebrew text in 9:25 uses 2 imperfect verbs, you shall know, vateda, and you shall understand, vataskel, which are clearly future tense in the context. The prophecy of Jeremiah 29, however, was given in 594 BC, which had already been announced before 538. So notice that Daniel is told, he says, this is going to happen, right? And that was way too, the prophecy given by Jeremiah came way too early. That would have been a past tense versus a future tense. Mickamiski's terminus ad quem, then the endpoint for the first 7 weeks, is then associated with the decree of Cyrus, which is actually 56 or 57 years and not 49 years. To justify this inconsistency, he claims that the numbers are symbolic and not to be taken literally due to the text belonging to the apocalyptic literary genre. In addition, the period of the 69 weeks spans from Cyrus to the Antichrist. That's a long period of time. Mick believes that the Antichrist is the Messiah who was cut off. He actually believes that the Antichrist was cut off in 926, and the one who makes a firm covenant. So he's cut off, and he also makes the firm covenant. Now we believe in the latter, of course, but not the former. Because of the enormous amount of time between the 69th and the 70th week, he admits that a literal interpretation, and get this, of 927 requires a gap in order for it to be feasible. So he says that the dispensational gap is a feasible way to understand it. It's a legitimate way to understand it. This is a clear concession that a parenthesis is not unreasonable, but necessary for literal interpretation. Once again, however, instead of taking the numbers literally, Mick must resort to the use of symbolic numbers, although this time from an ancient Near Eastern perspective. Unexpectedly, Robert Chisholm supports Mick symbolic arrangement for Daniel 9, 24 through 27. Quote, "It is quite natural that the ultimate consummation of God's program would be concentrated in the single 70th week. The intermediate 62 weeks designate the long period between Cyrus and the beginning of this culminating week. Though this period of 62 weeks may be disproportionate to the first period of 7 weeks, this is only problematic for those who demand mathematical precision. However, such precision may be foreign to the apocalyptic literary genre." So, I mean, that's surprising coming from somebody that teaches at Dallas Seminary, right? It's really shocking. The weeks, however, should not be taken symbolically, but literally. Dukan asserts the 70 weeks prophecy must be interpreted with regard to history in as realistic a way as Daniel did for the prophecy of Jeremiah. He then adds, this stands against the symbolic interpretation. Thus, in response to Chisholm's defense of Mick symbolical view, Thomas McCall aptly concludes, for Chisholm, there is no clear schedule for the coming of the Messiah in this prophecy, but only mysterious symbolism. And I think that was a very apt statement there. Now, what I want you to show here is a literary structure for 9:25 through 27, done by Dukan and Owusu Antwi. And it's very interesting how they divided up the passage. So you can see A prime and B prime, A2, B2, A3, B3. And what they noticed was that all the A's have to do with some sort of messianic figure. So they think that A deals with Messiah and B deals with the temple, right? And so when you look at that, it's like Messiah the Prince, A1, A2, 62 weeks until Messiah is cut off without any help, A3, and he shall make a strong covenant. So here we have a false Messiah. We have an anti-Messiah in A3, right? B1, restored, the city's going to be restored, sanctuary. So the B's all deal with Jerusalem and the temple, okay? And then B3, the wing of abominations, we're talking about the desolator. The Antichrist is going to set up his image according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Okay, so let's keep going. The value aspect of the structuring device is that it isolates the clauses that refer to the Messiah and the ones that correspond to the city of Jerusalem. Owusu Antwi notes the details of the prophecy are arranged in AB form with the two motifs of Messiah and Jerusalem in all the verses. The time elements are consistently connected with the Messiah portions. Regarding A1 and A2, the structure shows that Messiah the Prince, 25A, will come after 7 and 62 weeks or a 483-year period. The first 7-year period may refer then to the completion of the city, as Robert Newman tentatively proposes. Perhaps the first 7 weeks, if one may hazard a guess, involves the actual rebuilding of the city. What is certain, however, is that the only references to Jesus as Messiah Prince comes at 925A and 926A. Therefore, all subsequent references to the Prince in 926B and the he who makes a strong covenant in 927a must refer to another person, since the first Messiah, the Prince, had been cut off after the 69 weeks. The juxtaposition of Messiah, the Prince in A1, 925a, and Messiah in A2, 926a, versus the Prince in B2, 926b, and the He in A3, 927a, whose nearest antecedent points back to the Prince in B2, demonstrates that he is a false Prince and a false Messiah, that is the Antichrist. Thus, the reference to the Prince in 926b must be the Antichrist, whom we know is connected to the little horn of Daniel 7, 8, and 7:20. Interestingly, the word prince is fitting within the context of Daniel, since the fourth kingdom of Rome was described as consisting of 10 horns, but then a little horn rises in their midst. The interpretation given in Daniel 7, 24 through 25 relates the symbolism of the 10 horns to 10 kings, and the little horn as being another without using the word king, though the royal nature of the little horn is certainly by literary device known as ellipsis. Therefore, the little horn is a little king, and a fitting description of the prince who is to come. Charles Feinberg notes, interestingly enough, the people, the Romans, have already come, yet the prince is still to come. This prince cannot refer to Messiah the Prince, 925, since the date of his coming was already so carefully determined. Rather, this refers to a future prince from Rome, who was referred to in chapter 7 as the little horn, 7:8, 7:19 through 25. The parenthesis between 926 and 927 is now apparent. The context of Daniel 9:26 to 27 is Daniel 2 and 7. The first phase of the fourth kingdom of Rome is the historical setting of 926, when the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Jesus, the Messiah, was in fact cut off during the first phase of the fourth kingdom of Rome, when it was strong as iron and unified under a single emperor. Some 40 years later, the people, the prince to come, that is, the Romans, destroyed the city and the sanctuary in AD 70 under Titus, which is still within the first phase, since the Western Empire of Rome collapsed in AD 475 and the Eastern Empire in 1453. In 927, however, the second phase of the fourth kingdom of Rome will have already commenced before he, referring back to the prince to come in 926b, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, 927a. This act begins the 70th week, and the many must refer to the Jews and to the nation of Israel, who are now back in the land with a restored temple, since the prince will then put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering in the middle of the week. He will also take his seat in the temple and claim to be God, according to 2 Thessalonians 2:4b, as well as erect an image of himself and demand that everyone on earth worship it. The image of the beast, Revelation 13, 8 and 15. The end of the 70th week is given in 27c through d, and on the wing of abominations, one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. The destruction of the one who makes desolate comes at the end, comes at the time when the stone not cut from human hands will strike the Colossus image at its feet, or during the end of the second phase of the Roman kingdom, Daniel 2:34-35 and 44, which is parallel to the destruction of the little horn after his reign of 3.5 years, according to Daniel 7:24-25, which mirrors the same period of the prince to come, who breaks his covenant in the middle of the 70th week, Daniel 9:27b. These events are still future, and they will take place during the reign of the little horn, or the prince who is to come, who will be during the second, which will happen during the second phase of the Roman kingdom. Thus, the parenthesis visible in Romans 2 and 7, I should say Daniel 2 and 7, is also manifestly perceptible between 926 and 927. Here, I'm going to skip this a little bit just because I'll summarize. Walber makes a great case saying that since the text says very clearly that Messiah is cut off after the 69th week, that requires a gap. It requires a parenthesis, as well as the portion of text where it says that the people of the prince to come will destroy the temple, and that was a gap of actually 38 years. So Walber is saying this is very difficult. Now, here's a quote by E.J. Young. This is how somebody that's reformed would respond to that. It is true that the two events of verse 26 are said to take place after the 62 sevens. However, it is not said that the events of verse 27 occur after those of verse 26. That's very clever. This is mere assumption. The exposition has already shown that the whole picture of a Roman prince who makes a covenant for 1 week with the Jews is based upon an incorrect interpretation of the Hebrew. Since verse 26 declares that the Messiah is cut off by death, he must cause the covenant to prevail before he dies, or at least at the same time that he dies. The action of causing the covenant to prevail therefore, belongs to the 70th seven and is contemporaneous with the death of the Messiah. In other words, the one who makes the covenant is Jesus. So it's not Antichrist, it's Jesus Christ that makes the covenant, okay? Which belongs to, which is to be placed within the 70th seven. If this be so, there certainly is no reason for assuming that the 70th seven does not immediately follow the 62 sevens, okay? I mean, it's very creative, but it doesn't, it makes the text it's just, to me, it's gymnastics, right? This is exegetical gymnastics. So Walward replies, historically, the destruction of Jerusalem occurred in AD 70, almost 40 years after the death of Christ. Although some expositors like Young hold that the sacrifices are caused to cease by Christ in his death, which they considered fulfilled in the middle of the last 7 years, it is clear that this does not provide in any way for the fulfillment of an event 38 years or more after the end of the 69th seven. Young and others who follow the continuous fulfillment theory are left without any explanation adequate for interposing an event as occurring after the 69th seven by some 38 years, which in their thinking would actually occur after the 70th week. In a word, their theory does not provide any normal or literal interpretation of the text and its chronology. Okay, I mean, that's 2 more minutes? 2 minute warning, okay. Well, let me get to a little bit of Romans 11 before we quit. Okay, and you can read this online. It's all there online. Basically, my basic point is I'm actually going to argue against O. Palmer Robertson's book, The Israel of God. And so what Robertson says in this book is that there is no future for Israel. And so what he says is that what Paul is saying in Romans 11 is that it's not saying that the Jews are going to be like after the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. It's not like the Jews, God's going to turn to the Jews and start to work on them. But what he's saying there, according to Robertson, is that Paul is saying that the fullness of the Gentiles represents not just the Gentiles, but also the Jews. So all Israel means the fullness of the Jews and the fullness of the Gentiles together, compromising Israel. Okay, so what I do here is I basically try to argue using even Reform scholars saying that they don't believe that. Most of the New Testament commentators, and I have a bunch of them here, C.E.B. Cranfield, Leon Morris. So for example, here's what Leon Morris writes. This is a temporary hardening taking place while God's purpose is worked out among the Gentiles, as Paul puts it, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. The word NIV renders full number is rendered fullness in verse 12. NIV may well be right in seeing a reference to number. In that case, a certain number of Gentiles are to be saved, and God is waiting until that number has been reached. And notice what he says, before taking action for Israel. So this is a Reformed scholar. Wow. So even a Reformed scholar would go against Robertson. So let me go to the last paragraph before we quit. And this chart here is by a scholar named John Goodrich, who teaches at Moody. And what he's done is he's helpfully kind of charted off 3 phases. So first phase, second phase, third phase. And I want you to look at particularly here in 25 through 27. So the first phase, Israel is partially hardened because of their unbelief. Second phase, God then turns to the Gentiles. Okay, so there's a fullness of the Gentiles that enters. And then the third phase is now all Israel's salvation. Jacob's ungodliness banished, sins removed. So there are 3 phases. And so what I'm trying to say is that that second phase is a parenthesis. That second phase of the Gentiles. I mean, when you read the book of Acts, that surprised the early church. Like it surprised, I mean, Peter was surprised that the Holy Spirit fell on Gentiles. And so that seems to suggest that nobody saw that parenthesis. And in fact, the early part was at Acts chapter 1. They're asking Jesus, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? So they thought that the kingdom was coming. So they didn't see a parenthesis. They thought Jesus was going to immediately usher in the kingdom. But he says, no, no, no. You're going to be my witnesses from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends of the earth. There is a parenthesis. There is this fullness of the Gentiles that now must be brought in before God goes back to Israel. And that's going to happen at the 70th week, right? And so what's interesting is that I'll end with this, because this is John Darby, right? Good as dispensationalist as anybody. Here's what Darby says. Darby also has the same three-phase progression. Phase one, many of the Israelite branches, the natural heirs of the promises, had been cut off because of their unbelief. For when the fulfillment of the promises was offered them, they rejected it. So that's phase one. Phase two, thus the Gentiles made partakers of the promises, stood on the principle of faith, but there was a positive counsel of God accomplished in that which took place, namely the partial blinding of Israel, for they were not rejected until all the Gentiles who were to have a part in the blessing of these days should have come in. That's the second phase. And then phase three, after this, Israel should be saved as a whole. So now God is working with ethnic Israel. It should not be individual spared and added to the assembly, in which Israel had no longer any place as a nation. They should be saved as a whole, as Israel. Christ shall come forth from Zion as the seat of his power, and shall turn away iniquity from Jacob, God pardoning them all transgressions. So even with Darby saw the same three phases that John Goodrich pointed out. And then so finally, a distinction, however, must be made between the fullness of the Gentiles and the times of the Gentiles. The latter phrase describes the four empires that will endure until the return of Christ, corresponding to Daniel 2 and 7. Jesus himself coined the phrase, noting that the Gentiles would trample down Jerusalem until the end. By contrast, the former phrase deals with God's plan related to the salvation of the Gentiles due to the rejection of Israel's Messiah by the Jewish people and his subsequent salvation of Israel. Furthermore, on the one hand, the times of the Gentiles began with Babylon and will end with the judgment of the Antichrist and his forces at the end of the 70th week of Daniel. On the other hand, the fullness of the Gentiles began at the salvation of the Samaritans and will continue until the rapture of the church. H.A. Ironside aptly states, the fullness of the Gentiles has to do with God's present work of grace. When he has taken out from among the Gentiles a people for his name, when the last soul who is to be saved in this age has come to Christ, the church will be completed and the fullness of the Gentiles will have come in. Then the church will be caught up to be with the Lord before the 70th week of Daniel begins. So that's basically it. Thanks for the extra 11 minutes. Sorry, but we started late. We started late.
3 minutes late.
By the way, there's a class full of kids that are just getting let out right now. They're like in the stairwell coming up. So that's all that.
Okay.
All that is.
Oh, another right to the door.
Yeah, another right up. Maybe we should invite them in.
Back in the there's a lot in the door. Just one or two was bad enough.
A flood. Use the
Daniel got it here.
There needs to be a parenthesis or something between them.
Are there questions or comments?
Yeah.
Jen?
Edwin, when you talked about the interpretation where the two verses are switched, are there any other parts in the Bible where things are flipped like that, where you wouldn't take it chronologically? Sorry, that's a term.
I mean, it's what we do know in both Hebrew and Greek narrative, even poetry, poet text, that there is something called a chiasm, where you have inverted lines. I mean, and then you have different types of chiasms. So this like A, B, A, B, A, B, that's a different type of a literary structure than, let's say, a chiastic structure. But they run throughout the Bible, Hebrew and Greek, Aramaic as well.
But that one thing you talked about where it should be verse 27 should take place before 26.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about.
That's not- yes.
Oh, you're talking about E.J. Young's
Yeah,
comment.
Yeah,
No,
what's the name of the
It takes it out of
Hebrew
order.
term for what he says is there?
no, he didn't. Ethnog.
Other examples where that's used consistently with the preferred translation.
There are cases where it should take a full disjunctive.
Okay.
But let me show you. Let me see if I have my. my full version of my paper, which I don't see. Because what I did was I basically cut that part out. Let me see if I can. Here it is. I'll show you some of the passages that have the ethnoc in it right here. So, and again, I mean, none of these are going to be examples of where it's a full stop. Okay.
Oh, so that's important.
But check out Daniel 1:6. And there was among them from the sons of Judah, ethnoc, Daniel, Hananiah, and Azariah. So notice you don't want to put a period there. You don't want to put a full disjunction, but it's more like a colon, right? It kind of like, you know, colon, Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah. Here's Daniel 8:20. The ram which you saw with two horns, ethnoc, right? The kings of Media and Persia. So the accent here cannot be a full disjunctive due to the two clauses needing the connecting verb is, or could be functioning as a colon. So you either stick an is there, or it could be functioning as a colon. Okay, but again, it's not functioning as a full disjunctive. It would make no sense. 9:2, in the first year of the reign, of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books ethnoc, the number of years which came by the word of God to Jeremiah the prophet that he would accomplish for the desolation of Jerusalem 70 years. There is clearly, it's like a function, it's such a, like a comma almost, right? But again, it's not a full disjunctive. It's not a period, right? And there are passages where sometimes you have the ethnoc, but there's no disjunctive value at all.
Okay.
Yeah, so you just completely ignore the
Sometimes
ethnoc.
it does serve as a full disjunctive.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, and what Beckwith is saying, is that the rabbinical scholars, the early translations like the Theodotian Septuagint, the Vulgate, the Syriac, none of those take the ethnoc. They read 7 and 62 together.
I like that you have the 3 other parts of Daniel, but do we have a full disjunctive use of it in Daniel ever?
I have to go back and see.
That's a
Yeah,
good question.
yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, how many uses of ethnoc are in Daniel? How many?
Oh, there's a lot. 'Cause
Okay.
every,
So this-
yeah, I mean, the ethnoc is basically like, it's not, it doesn't divide a verse exactly in half, but it divides it within its sense. Like it's a sense divider.
Right, okay, so keep your sense, that makes sense.
So
So is this very much a stylistic
it's more of a, let me show you
of the
from,
writer? In other words, do they have a propensity to use consistent in a certain way?
Right, exactly, yeah.
they could, but let me just show you what an ethnoc looks like. And you can kind of see it from, like, let's say, I'll just say Genesis 1:1, just to kind of take an easy text.
Let's see.
If you put the right glasses on, that becomes English.
Yeah.
So do you see this? It kind of looks like an arrow pointing up. That's an ethnoc.
Okay,
So it's Bereshit bara Elohim et Hashemayim va et haaretz. So it's in the beginning God created. So that would be weird to put a period here, because you're cutting off the direct objects, right? So here I would say it doesn't have a full disjunctive at all. This is where you just ignore the ethnoc. This is where you ignore it.
it's used a lot throughout the whole Hebrew Bible. It's not a.
Oh
Daniel
yeah,
thing.
no, every verse has an ethnoc. It's the major versifier.
Then trying to weight your theological conclusion based on something used so much
Is
would be tenuous
at best, yes,
Yeah.
at best.
Well, they're also supplied by the peasants, right?
That correct.
It's not original. Daniel's right.
Correct. So that's why when people point to the Dead Sea Scrolls and they say that ethnoc is not really taken there, then it's like, hey, that's pretty strong.
I got a question on great, I think it's so much, John.
Sure.
On So how would the Robert Chisholm, and again, I heard it for a number of people, but that should be said, but he was, he's an interesting man. We never entirely agreed. But how did they cut him off of you will be cut off?
Yeah.
How would you take that?
I think he completely agrees with Thomas Comiskey.
Okay.
So he just basically, like when you read it in his Handbook of the Prophets, that's the text where he is published by Baker, where he's like completely like for Daniel 9. And the thing is, I used to, at Southern California Seminary, I used to assign that book until I started reading some of the interpretations. I thought, hey, some Dallas is going to be saved. Not so fast.
Oh,
Not so much.
We go case by case.
So I mean, you know, I don't want to, I want to be fair to him, but what I've noticed is that even in his exegesis to exposition, that Hebrew grammar, like he always goes against any sort of messianic interpretation.
Oh.
So he doesn't have a messianic interpretation of Daniel 9. He doesn't have one for, for Genesis like 22. Even Genesis 3. I wonder if he even thinks that that's a messianic. 3:15 is messianic.
I think he's skeptical.
Yeah.
I almost got the impression he wanted to. It's the verses that he would do that on pretty well known.
Right.
I just remember reading going.
Right. So, I mean, I'm not trying to, I don't have a, you know, I've never had him, so I don't have a vendetta against Tucker, just, but, yeah.
He would, yeah.
Schism for Hebrew. So I'm familiar with that, and I asked him a key question in class, and he didn't. It was not well written.
He's still the one.
Yeah, because it was interesting, and he's a Hebrew guy, I'm not, but we go through and do assignments, and they're like, okay, look at how this is translated here, and we're using the PDH, and they go, okay, look at everything else, and it was the only place that was interpreted like that, so we're using the PDH to refute the PDH, and it dawned on me, like, wait, you're using the PDH to refute, that's what our site was. I said, well, how do we know the PDH then is correct in the other places? That was not the question to ask. Well, because, I mean, he's using the PDH to refute. You can't, I don't think you can necessarily do that. You can't, anyway. So it was interesting. Wonderful man. I mean, he's
Never met him, so I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
He's kind of rogue. He's a little bit rogue.
You're going to talk about Yankees, that baseball.
Oh, yes.
He talked about that all day long.
There's a hockey team.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
But
It's awesome.
so back to the early interpreters.
Yeah.
Page 10.
Okay.
So my comments claim that the Afna was here by
Yeah, he's like 300, right?
Correct.
Right around
Yeah,
300.
exactly. So this is the era of yeah, Alexandria. So what do they do? And you mentioned here, what do they do with the earlier Irenaeus, Justinara, even the
Mhm.
they kind of skip that.
Well, what I noticed about Comiskey was that he was very selective.
Okay.
So he would never point to anything that was kind of like, you know, contradicted him.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of like, it was kind of weird. I noticed that also with O.P. Robertson, that he missed like 2 major verses in Romans 11. He didn't comment on those. And those 2 verses basically gave away it was like, it let the cat out of the bag, right? Those were the 2 big verses. And I was like, that's kind of weird that you don't comment on, you know, the obvious verses, because it says that all Israel will be saved. It's future tense. It's not being saved or have been saved. It's will be saved. So, yeah, I just think that that's,
Selective.
it's very selective, and you're not dealing with the issues where you're, you're trying to advance knowledge. You're trying to like help everybody just, understand this together. I mean, I'm not like, I'm coming from a reformed, Calvinistic background, because I was ordained in PC. I went to Westminster Seminary. Michael Horton, we have the same kind of CV almost. He went to Biola, he went to Westminster, I went to Biola, he went to, I went to Westminster too. But then I saw that the literal interpretation, the grammatical historical interpretation was correct. And so the more I started interpreting the Bible, the more I agreed with the dispensationalists. So, it's like, we have to advance the discussion by looking at the text, wrestling with the text, and not trying to hide things. Or I don't know if that's what they're doing, but that's what it seemed like they were doing, because they weren't actually dealing with all of the evidence. And that's what kind of makes me skeptical, because I'm like, you're too good of a biblical scholar to ignore this, to not see this. Right. And so it's like, why isn't it there? Why haven't you talked about this? Why haven't you discussed this?
Well, because their immediate go-to is to spiritualize anything that doesn't fit an already presupposed theology.
Right.
See, the
Right.
problem is they have an entire theological system that they're reading as the lens. And anytime, because they claim to use the same grammatical things, except
Right.
when it deals with the distinction between Israel and the church, in which they will spiritualize every one of those passages as the intended meaning that God meant there. But when you spiritualize it, there is nothing to nail it to. You can make it be whatever fits your system.
Right.
And dispensationalists, I'm saying we got to get better at, being consistent as well. But I think our hermeneutic comes before our theology. If our theology ever gets to the point where our system comes before our hermeneutic, we're going to fall in the same errors.
Right. That's right. And I think, Mick Comiskey, for example, I think his interpretation was very like far left field. But it's interesting how someone like Robert Chisholm, who has, like you were saying, that the Reformed people are arguing from their tradition. Chisholm is not arguing from his tradition. He's actually going against his tradition and saying, Mick Comiskey's viewpoint wouldn't make sense to you if you expected mathematical precision. Yeah, and I was thinking, wow. And it's like, so you believe that the Antichrist was the one that was cut off? It's just very bizarre to me.
And interesting that you brought that also entries, was that the dissertation?
Yes, it was a dissertation at Andrews University in Michigan, Marion Springs, Michigan.
Okay, yeah, because, it's well done.
It's excellent. That dissertation is really well done. I don't agree with his view on Daniel 9, but his literary studies, they're really, really well done. Yes.
Yeah, love the paper, very, very nicely done. Thank you for this. Excellent work.
Thank you.
I did have a very nitpicky question.
Sure.
Here on page 8. And, yeah, maybe it's because I'm an editor, I'm just nitpicking, right?
Special place in
Yeah. Under eschatological interpretation, you have the terminus ad quem as being the midpoint of the 70th week.
Yeah,
Shouldn't
so
that be the end of the 70th week? Or am I missing something?
So what happens is that some dispensational interpreters, let me pull up another chart here. This chart was made by one of my former colleagues at RTS. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Here it is. So you'll see in this chart, widen it here. So Dr. Richard Belcher of RTS, Charlotte, I believe, here's what so let me show you the Reform view right here. So here we have all the way up to here is the death of Christ in the middle of the week. I see. And then for the next 3.5 years, this is a new covenant era. So this latter part of the week has now lasted 2,000 years. and going, it's going.
Mm.
So Roger Beckwith actually calls this a parenthesis. So he believes this, he holds to this. So Beckwith himself says that there's a parenthesis even within the reform scheme. But with us, we actually take the numbers literally, and we say, well, yeah, it's going to be a literal seven years for the 70th week, but the 69th week ended, and then Jesus died after the 69th week. The temple was destroyed after the 69th week. And so all of that is within the parenthesis.
Mm.
And so the 70th week doesn't begin until Antichrist makes a treaty with Israel. So, so it's when they're saying, well, you guys have this gap or parenthesis. Well, they have a gap. They have a parenthesis right here too. So I just think it's disingenuous of, amillennialists or reform people to poke fun of us, in that regard.
Mm.
Any other questions, comments?
Go back to that chart.
Sure,
Because everything to them is symbolic, right? On the whole date setting.
that's right.
539 to 433, 7 weeks. They're picking points in history to anchor based on nothing other than their own presupposition of where it needs to be anchored.
Right.
Because how are you gonna make 7 weeks, almost 100 years? And then 62 weeks, is 400 years, is really close, but not quite the same. And then you have,
Unless you are in mathematical.
unless you, if you want mathematical precision, but it's not even like there's a pattern that you can recognize to build on it. It literally is, you can just pick whatever you want and anchor it in something that sounds, which has been the problem with interpretation of many of the fathers, all the way from since the time of Christ.
Right.
Anchoring things in your geopolitical environment and making the predictions while you experience them.
That's right. That's right. Jen?
So with the mathematical imprecision, 10 toes don't mean 10 toes unless it's a human.
Yeah.
Unless they've got 6 toes.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is, like with Chisholm, like even there's a text, I believe, in 2 Kings. Was it 2 Kings? Yeah, 2 Kings, about the angel coming and destroying 186,000 Assyrian soldiers. Maybe it was Isaiah, and then 2 Kings also mentions it. Chisholm says it wasn't 186,000. That's just a number. Yeah, it's just a number. It was probably much less than 186,000 soldiers. And so he never takes numbers literally, and he's teaching at a dispensational school, which is kind of interesting. And so even with Daniel 9, it's not literal, it's just symbolic. It's completely symbolic. So yeah, I stopped assigning that book to. I mean, yeah.
So the snarky person in me says, so does he really want to be paid a certain amount every month? Or is that a symbolic idea?
That's right.
That assembly is big, so they have over 70 professors, so.
Right.
It's a big professor, 70, right?
It's just that he's very well published.
It's a publisher, it's also very well, respected.
Yeah.
So it's one of the household.
Yeah.
Like,
It's just that with you would think that an Old Testament scholar, Dallas, would be, trying to toe the line and trying to, if he's going to go against Walbert, or if he's going to go against Pentecost or Toussaint or any of these, giants within, Dallas history, he should actually tackle them, tackle their works and say, this is why I don't go with this. I go with this instead. So if somebody's going to change tradition, you don't just like step over them and start publishing your view. You need to deal with your predecessors and be fair to them and say why you don't believe what they teach here and why you change your mind.
And the only person who listens to was Dr. Jeffrey. Whenever we come. Hey, that's what I say now.
Dr. Bing is my old boss at Southwestern.
That's how I enjoy it.
Well, is that it?
Round of
All
applause.
right. Thank you.
Okay.